the Team Performance Podcast with Spencer Horn and Christian Napier. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Team Performance Winning Ways for Uncertain Times podcast. I'm Christian Napier, joined as always by the incomparable co-host Spencer Horn in the salmon shirt, it looks like. Spencer, how you doing?
Your favorite, isn't it? I'm well. How are you, Christian?
I'm doing pretty darn good. The weather is fairly warm here in Salt Lake City. I'm looking forward to going for a nice afternoon walk with my wife once we're done with this podcast here.
What time do you usually go? You usually go in the afternoon, but is there a set time or just when the opportunity arises?
It's usually when the opportunity arises because of calls, business calls and things like that. So sometimes it'll be earlier, sometimes a little bit later, but definitely before the sun goes down.
Well, I knew I was calling you right when the sun was coming up this morning, about 7:30, and you were on a call somewhere around the world. Couldn't take that call.
Well, unfortunately, my IOC laptop is out of date. And so the IOC technology department was saying, hey, we need to get your laptop updated, your IOC laptop updated with the most recent software. So I was in the middle of a remote session with our friends at the IOC. So I apologize.
Well, I shouldn't have called you at 7:30 in the morning anyway, but I just had this idea while I was out on my run this morning. So,
well, I appreciate the ideas that you shared. And I am so excited, Spencer, to introduce you to our guest today. Sometimes we just do this podcast amongst ourselves. Sometimes we have one guest, but it's a rare treat when we actually have two guests on the podcast. So I'm super excited to introduce them. So our guests today are Maureen Sweeney and Todd Dennett from Tiller Language Services. I've known them for a long time. Maureen since the 2002 Olympic winter, Paralympic Winter Games. Todd worked there as well. I hope to get Todd on my Salt Lake 2002 podcast. Shameless plug right there. To talk about flags. So anyway, they've got very long, distinguished careers. I'm not aging you at all by making that comment. But fascinating people. I'm looking forward to them kind of telling their story a little bit. But before I do, I just want to say thank you for joining the podcast. It's been nice working with Tiller. Full disclosure, Tiller has provided language services to the IOC in a project that I've been working on, the Structured Interviews Project, and really enjoyed the working experience with them providing simultaneous interpretation, really top-notch interpreters for the projects that I've been working on. And it's been a very wonderful collaborative work and I've really, really enjoyed working with them. So Maureen, Todd, thank you so much for coming on.
Happy to be here. Having us.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about where you're joining us from and give us a little background on yourselves as well as Tiller Language Services.
Todd, shall I start or do you want to start?
Sure, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, great. So thanks to both of you for having us on the podcast. We appreciate you being interested in what we do. I am in Salt Lake City here with Christian. And yeah, so I guess there are so many things I could say about Tiller Language Services, but maybe we just start out with who we are. So Todd and I have been working together since, when did you come? When did I hire you? I hired Todd at the games in
2001.
2001. Wow.
Almost 20 years ago, I started.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, I hired Todd. It's kind of funny to age us even more. Todd was, I think, the first person that I interviewed remotely back in 2001. And at that time you had to go to like the special conference room and set up a link, and his head was on a giant screen. And it's just funny now thinking about all of the stuff that we do, using technology remotely, just every single day. And what a big deal it was to be able to interview him from Washington, D.C. to Salt Lake and be able to see his face. Anyway, kind of funny. So Todd and I started working together way back then. And And now we are business partners at Tiller Language Services. So maybe I'll hand it to Todd and he can tell you how we got from Salt Lake to today. Does that sound like a good segue?
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah, so I met Maureen in 2001. It is funny to think about now that we're doing this over Zoom, like how hard it was to do that video interview then. I'd been working in politics. I worked for Vice President Gore in the White House. And when that opportunity ended, was looking to move to the Olympics, and remember having to go to a big office building downtown that I'd never been to, and was ushered into a weird room with a gigantic setup to be able to talk to Maureen and the rest of the crew in Salt Lake City. So thrilled that she hired me and I moved out to Salt Lake City. I'm now in Seattle, Washington, which is where the business is based. But after the Olympics, Maureen and I both went sort of our separate ways and worked on a variety of different projects. But I started an event planning firm in 2008 called Tiller, where we do international conferences and events all around the world, mostly for mission-driven organizations. We work for the Gates Foundation, we work for Paul Allen's philanthropy, other large groups like that. And we were doing a lot of events that required interpretation. And we built up kind of a network of people that could help us at some of the international events. Maureen has a strong background in language services from working at the Olympics. And so it was a natural fit for our event planning company. And then some of those same clients started coming to us and asking just for translation or interpretation for projects that we weren't planning as events. And we sort of saw the opportunity to spin it out into a separate business. So Maureen and I partnered together and created Tiller Language Services. Let's see, it was in 2014. So almost 7 years ago now.
Yeah, it was interesting because in 2013, it sort of started hitting a critical mass where we had so many requests that were only for language related projects that, you know, Todd and I were talking and we were like, well, maybe this is a business too. You know, it is a little bit weird for people to come to an event business to get like translation of their policies and procedures or their website. So it was sort of interesting at that point. We had the requests. We didn't know too much about having a language services agency. So we actually did, I'm kind of proud of us now because we actually took the time. We took a good 8 months and we hired someone we knew well to really do a full business plan and a lot of research about what that would mean. Like, what is the industry doing? How could we differentiate ourselves? And what was fascinating is through that research project, we learned that language services agencies that were competing on price were proliferating like crazy. The industry was booming, but it was all about undercutting everyone else. And what we realized is that what people were coming to us for was the exact opposite. All of our initial clients were people who had had problems with their prior language services and were willing to pay more to make sure that the quality was there. So, you know, I can tell you that one of our very first projects, the client came to us and said, we have this website and, you know, we're getting a lot of complaints, particularly about the Chinese. And we were wondering if you could have your people look at it. It was a client that we work with for events. If you could have your team look at it and tell us, is this really bad or what's going on? So we contacted our folks that, you know, our top leads for Chinese, and we had them do a review, and they came back to us and they literally said, like, this actually isn't Chinese. Like, this is something, but it
looks
doesn't,
like Chinese characters.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't mean anything. And this client, who I think I probably shouldn't mention who they are, but they're a very big name, and they're very international, and they were horrified. So that, I think everything coalesced at that moment, and we realized there's a place for us in this industry that's being really sort of ignored. And there are people who really want to make sure that what they're doing is of a high quality and works, and are not so concerned about, is it 2 cents cheaper than,
It's always about value,
Yeah.
Maureen, when you make it because there's no value to having a website that no one can understand. If it translates, absolutely none whatsoever. But when you were talking about, you said something that, every once in a while I wax musical, and all of a sudden the West Side Story, there's a place for us. came into my mind when you said that, somewhere there's a place for us. But so really fascinating. It sounds like it seems like those type of services, translation services, would not be interrupted this last year. I mean, people needing their website and their materials, but I'm really interested in that event side. So give us an example of some of the types of events that you would do for a mission-driven organization like the Gates Foundation, where you would need, because I speak internationally. So I was in the Dominican Republic not too long ago, and I'm speaking, and half the audience doesn't speak English, and so they have a booth at the back of the room with somebody translating for half of the audience.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's what we do. Todd, you want to take this one? I've yammered on for a bit already.
Yeah, I mean, we've done exactly that. We've taken that similar technology that you're used to in a hotel ballroom with interpreters in the back of the room in the booths, and been able to replicate that now in the virtual world. As you can imagine, all of our in-person live events were canceled beginning in March of last year, and are continuing to be canceled for the foreseeable future. But we've been able to switch to Zoom or other platforms to make that work. So we use Zoom a lot, just like we're using today, and it has an interpretation module that our interpreters can join and provide another channel that the participants can listen to that way. Or we've also worked with another company to provide a standalone interpretation system that basically turns your smartphone into a headset, exactly like you'd experience in a hotel ballroom, listening to that headset that's connected to the interpreters in the back of the room.
And I just turned my sound down.
Yeah, you can still listen to the sound on Zoom if you want to hear the source language, but then you put a headset on from your smartphone and listen to the interpretation.
Wow, that's really fascinating.
And it has taken a bit of extra work, to get get the interpreters to figure out how to use this new system, train the participants how to use the new system. But it's actually great, and we've seen over the last year more and more organizations offering interpretation for meetings that maybe they wouldn't have done so in the past, just because of the travel or whatever would have been cost prohibitive. But if you're bringing people together from all around the world, now you can offer the language virtually.
So Todd and Maureen, I've got a question about that. The topic of this podcast is team performance, and you're working with a bunch of contractors. These interpreters are independent freelancers or contractors that work with agencies, whatever, very used to working in certain ways, right? Mm-hmm. And for them to do their job effectively, they have to have their setup just so, because it takes a lot of mental brain power to do the interpretation. You don't want to have a lot of extra bandwidth trying to figure out, well, do I hit this button here or that there? Yep. So did you get pushback from your interpreters when you started going this virtual space? I mean, I guess necessity is the mother of invention. People are like, well, I guess if I want to eat, I guess I need to figure out how to do it this new way so I can put food on my table. But how did your organization kind of manage the transition and the mindset of these interpreters from an in-person, sometimes there's travel involved, it's nice, there are a lot of perks that way. And then you have to transition to this new way. I mean, I would imagine that'd be a bit complicated. So can you kind of walk us through what that process was like? Not necessarily from a technology perspective, but from a personality or management perspective to get people to go from the old way of doing things to this new way.
You can tell that Christian's worked with interpreters before. I love it. they can sometimes be a little persnickety, let's say, about their setup. It's an excellent question. And you said necessity is the mother of invention. There's been a lot of necessity this year. And Todd and I actually talked about this specific issue yesterday when we were sort of prepping for this conversation. And we believe that sort of the fact that the pandemic hit, interpreters, people who primarily specialize in interpretation over translation. So when we say interpretation, we're talking about the spoken word, and we talk about translation, it's the written word. So they're two different specialties. So there are a lot of interpreters who suddenly had no work, like all their conferences were canceled and they were freaking out. And because of that, the fact that we were offering them opportunities to interpret remotely became a lot more palatable than it had been 6, 8, 10 months before. And also because we are, sort of our ethic is that we take care of our team, we provide training, we make sure people are hyper prepared for their events. We, with all of our contracts, we set up paid training for the interpreters, which a lot of companies don't do. They just expect you to figure out how to work with the systems, and they don't, reimburse you for that. But because we want to really be able to hold you to the fact that you know how to use the technology, we pay you to learn how to do it. But in the end, I feel like a lot of people that we work with were just much more open and willing to consider doing new things, kind of like all of us. I mean, this isn't just interpreters. If you want to succeed in this new environment, you've got to open yourself up to new approaches, try new things, be willing to be flexible. So I think we got a lot of people on board that, had we said a year earlier, hey, we want to do this remote event, they would have said, yeah, you know what, like, count me out, I don't want to do it. And interestingly, related to that, we've been able to find a lot of folks who, there are a lot of people in the industry who are, who both interpret and translate, but once they get to a certain level, they give up the translation because people in general prefer interpreting. You go in, you work your 8 hours, you're done. Whereas with translation, it's like writing a term paper every day, and everyone has an opinion about how you translate it. And, translation is an art, not a science. So, but in this environment, again, there were a lot of people who are great translators, but don't usually do that work, who have come back to doing more translation. So I feel like for us, we were able to kind of take advantage of the fact that there are people out there right now with incredible skills and backgrounds who are willing to maybe do more and do different things than they were willing to do a year ago, because they're trying to fill their calendars that suddenly went poof when, all the live events were canceled. So that's my riff on that.
So talk about some of these virtual events. What are they? Are they with these mission-driven organizations, or are they all kinds?
It can really be anything. We've done a lot of work with the Gates Foundation for different conferences that they've been doing. We worked closely with the Biden campaign last fall and did, over 120, 150 events with them over the course of several months. There's a case where they never would have been able to provide interpretation, because if you were doing a big crowd event and a speech, outdoors in a rally, as you typically do for a regular campaign event, you could never hand out headsets to everyone in the crowd that needed it. But now in a virtual event, someone can push a button and hear Spanish or French or Arabic or whatever language we want to do.
And I think we've done some climate groups that we've done remote events for. I mean, it's really run the gamut of different types of organizations. As Todd said, a lot of them are sort of these big international NGOs with missions, but then honestly, for about 3-4 months there, the campaign took up a huge, we did a lot of work for them as well. So,
I mean,
quite a variety.
It sounds like this is like the United Nations, where people always have those ear things on. You guys are behind the scenes doing all those things at the Hague or United Nations, but maybe they have all their own internal structures for that.
Yeah, a lot of those. So like the State Department, the UN, some of those biggies, they have their own teams,
right?
And they'll even have like their own installed equipment if they have a location that they always hold their meetings in. That being said, there are other international agencies that will hire freelancers. So it's it depends, but like the UN system, the State Department, some of those folks, they have internal resources. But if you're talking about a smaller international agency, they might be hiring that out each time.
So where does one go to find the list of smaller agencies on climate or whatever? I mean, how do you find those events?
I would say mostly they find us.
That's what I was going to say. We don't really. we're the backwards model to that. Todd, do you want to talk to that?
Most of our business, comes through referrals, having worked with people before. People, search for language services providers. The one thing, just quickly going back to the last question, that I think has changed a lot over the last year is the type of assignments. Like meetings might be much shorter now than they were in the past. Like I would say before 2020, the typical assignment would be at least a day or a couple of days for a conference. But now we do a lot of meetings that are only an hour long or 2 hours long, that in the past, clients would have never wanted to pay to fly somebody to that location to do a 1 hour meeting. But virtually now it again has become much more cost effective.
I have a question about that. I don't want to, I'm not going to ask for real fees, but you could say, marshmallows or, how many coconuts you're charging for your services. Have you seen that change? Are you able to then say, hey, we're going to pass on savings, but our fees are in fact more because we've had to invest in more equipment, more training? I mean, how have you managed that? Because a lot of speakers and event organizations, they've really struggled with this question.
I mean, I think it's something we've struggled with as well, but I would say for the most part, the fees to the clients have remained mostly the same. The area for savings for them is that you're not paying for people to travel, or you're not paying for an extra day of someone's time to get somewhere to do the meeting. You're more likely just paying for the meeting time itself. And the equipment is cheaper if you're using Zoom or a mobile app than it is to install those booths in the back of the room and have several technicians there to run it and build it in with your AV system. So that's where really the savings come in, not so much from the interpretation itself.
And I think the other thing that's changed in the industry that has resulted in a cost savings for clients is, in the past, many interpreters would only work a day at a time. So they had just a day rate. And so it didn't matter how long you had them, they still charged you for a day. There were a few people who would do a half day rate, but that half day rate was generally not half. It was like 2/3. Now that one of the things that sort of changed across the board is that many more interpreters, I would say almost all interpreters have a true half day rate now, and many of them will have a 2 hour rate. So whereas in the past, for that 1 day meeting, even if they only interpreted for an hour, we would have to charge you for a day because the interpreter charged us for a day. Now, because people truly are working a 1 hour meeting, they're doing it from home and they can schedule other work. We're able to kind of pass that cost savings on to clients. And that's a big change actually, because I think a lot of interpreters really pushed against that, understandably to a certain extent, because it's very difficult as an interpreter to fit multiple live events into 1 day. Yeah. And if you signed up for something, you're it's too difficult to get to the next location. Whereas online, we know a lot of interpreters that we work with who have been able, they can say, all right, I have my 2 hour rate, and they can have 3 different events online at the 2 hour rate and earn their day rate. So that's a industry-wide change that was very hotly discussed over like the summer and early fall. There were a lot of people who didn't want to do that. But, as an agency, we're like, listen, at this point, there's enough people doing it that you probably need to consider doing it as well. So it's, I find that part kind of interesting, and it's a change across the board.
So Todd and Maureen, I want to come back to something you said earlier. When you initially set up Tiller Language Services, you went through a very thorough process. You took 8 months to define this plan. And I'm implying or assuming that part of that, as you talked about a little bit, was you looked at your competition and you said, okay, well, there's a commoditization of this industry happening now, and strategically we're going to go in a different direction. And the other threat, of course, that's always been looming in the background is AI, right? Like the
AWS, even from Amazon, you can just
So, but those are things that you could kind of plan for, right? You like, okay, we can develop our strategic plan, and we can mold our business to minimize those threats, to maximize our opportunities. The pandemic's a completely different animal. Nobody saw this coming, and it's thrown everybody for a loop. And so I'm curious, what was it that allowed Tiller to really excel in this crazy environment, while other companies may have struggled harder to make adjustments? So I'm curious, as you look at how you've done so far, understanding that we're still in the throes of it, hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel this year. What was it that allowed Tiller to really, as I mentioned before we started this call, take the lemons and turn them into lemonade?
Todd, you wanna try
I think we've always been, since we founded the company, really been sort of innovative and always looking for new opportunities. So in some ways, we're always changing and evolving. So the pandemic wasn't that big a hurdle for, at least for Tiller Language Services. Mm-hmm. That said, I think because we had built close relationships with clients, those clients were continuing to do work through the pandemic. We were all more easily able to sort of pivot together. Mm-hmm. And now, once we'd done a few of those things, it was easier for us to then market ourselves to others, saying, look, we're doing this already in the virtual space. We've got experience doing it. Let us help you continue.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think I think that it's an interesting thing to think about. There's a couple of things. I agree with Todd. I think that we've always been sort of following our own tune, so to speak. Like, we're so different from most language services agencies and how they kind of approach the service and the industry overall. I think we just sort of went our own way. That helped us a lot. I think also we were fortunate to, because of the clients that we have and the connections that we have, there are some things out there that have there are other industries that have thrived that we've been involved in. So for instance, we had a big client who was involved with communications and PR around various COVID campaigns. Those campaigns, you see them everywhere, like wear a mask in multiple languages. So we got some clients specifically because of the pandemic. So there's a piece there. And I think the clients that came to us to do that work already knew sort of about our approach and were comfortable to come to us with these very big contracts that were only coming up because of the current situation. Another big client of ours is TikTok. TikTok has boomed this year. They have because everyone's at home, trapped in their house, on their computer, watching videos. So I feel like, on the one hand, we were sort of uniquely able to approach this sort of situation because we're used to looking at things differently. But on the other hand, we got some contracts that came about because of the pandemic, honestly. Like, I really don't think TikTok would have exploded this year the way it did had everyone not been trapped at home on their phones. And obviously, communications and PR campaigns around the virus are, they wouldn't have existed. So there's a combination there. Yeah, we're great, but we also benefited in some ways,
Yeah, and I think part of that is the trust we built with clients before,
Yeah.
As we talked about before, we offer sort of a higher quality, a higher level of service. So you're not just getting sort of, a lot of people will just put text through like Google Translate, and you get a very sort of a word for word literal translation, but you don't get the nuance. And so we've often worked with clients in the past who that message and nuance is very, very important. And so for something like COVID, where the nuance matters, they knew they could trust us already and came to us to handle those delicate messages.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's never about price. It's always about what it is that the problem that you're solving, the size of the problem, the value that you're bringing. And so I think that's a great business model.
But you'd be surprised how many people will go for the cheapest provider first, just because they themselves don't speak whatever language it is they're, translating or interpreting into. So they're think Spanish is Spanish, Chinese is Chinese. I'll just go for the lowest price, and then are often quickly burned because they've realized the message isn't delivered the way they want it, and the effort and time they put into creating their English text or copy then is greatly diminished by the poor quality of their translation. So that's how they then end up back with Tiller.
We've actually, when we've talked to different marketing, consultants and looked into like how would we expand our marketing efforts, we've often said, like, if there was a list somewhere of companies that had bad first experiences with language services agencies, like, that is the majority, I would say, aside from personal contacts of Todd and I, and even many of them are personal contacts of Todd and I, most people have had a bad experience, and they come to us and they're like, oh my gosh, it was so embarrassing, or this ad, or we got complaints. Like, I feel like 90% of the people that we work with had to learn first that not all language services are created equal, and then they came to us. So
so you're reaping the benefit of all those incompetent providers.
I guess.
So where do you see, how do you see things changing now? I mean, how, obviously some events came back in the initial throes of the COVID pandemic, everybody just didn't know what to do. And so everything shut down, and that was a really tough time. But I mean, what do you see changing? I was just watching a 60-minute show, and I can't remember the pianist name, Igor from, he's originally from Nizhny Novgorod in Russia, but he's a German citizen, and he played for the Nobel Prize event on. He's just an amazing pianist. He's like 33 years old, and he just went on Twitter and created like 300 live events and is just killing it. I mean, hundreds of thousands of followers, but people are getting so creative. But what do you see happening in 2021 in this event space? And we've got the Olympics that are supposedly going to happen in, is it August, Christian?
Yeah, July, August.
So what are you seeing with your advanced contracts? I mean, are meetings getting back to normal? Is there going to be a hybrid mix? What do you know? What are you noticing?
I mean, I think we're seeing very few in-person events being scheduled yet, but people are starting to think about it. But I do think in the future, there'll be much more hybrid models where perhaps not all the participants will gather together. Some will be online, some will be in person. I think the way the technology's developed so rapidly over the last year for interpretation, that you could see a future state where instead of having the booth in the back of the room, that the interpreter could be still sitting in their house, but providing interpretation for the people sitting in the room. And that's where I think a lot will evolve over the next couple of years. You mentioned AI too. There's a lot of companies out there that are betting on AI for the future. Right now, we've looked at it, several times. It's not good enough for what we do. It gives you, again, sort of very literal translation, but if there's any nuance or technical jargon in your content, the AI is just not there to do it yet.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're going to see a lot more people who have gotten familiar with this remote interpreting approach. And regardless of whether the event is happening with live participants or not, they're going to be looking at using remote interpreters to avoid the cost of travel and the cost of the actual physical equipment in the room. And I do think that a lot of people who haven't used interpreting before, kind of like our experience with the campaign where they couldn't do it unless they wanted a consecutive interpreter up there to double the length of their meeting time, etc. I think there could be an overall increase in the use of interpreting because the option to do it remotely is available. And because they have seen, hey, this is bringing in new audiences and there's value here, and it's not as expensive as I thought it was going to be just because I can do it using these platforms. So I feel sort of fortunate that Todd and I kind of dove in head first, kind of looking at all the different models, because I don't think it's going to go away, and I think it'll proliferate, and I think there'll be a lot of opportunities there that weren't there before.
Well, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about what you do is people at a fundamental level want to connect with each other, and the way that they connect with each other is through language, and it's all the more important now, in a crisis mode.
Yes.
People actually want more communication, not less, right? We want to engage more. And I'm so happy to see that you have found ways to help people do that more and better. Now, I've taken up a lot of our time, most of our time, and we don't have much left, but you've given us a lot of great lessons that you've learned along the way. It sounds to me like one of the reasons that you succeeded was because of the foundation that you laid at the outset, and the way you wanted to go allowed you to succeed. in unexpected situations. But if there was one lesson that you could draw from your experience so far through this pandemic, what would that lesson be?
I mean, I guess this is an obvious one, but just to be flexible. As the technology's changed, we've all done virtual meetings where someone's internet has gone out or whatever has happened to the bandwidth has gone away. So just being flexible, hiring people that share that sort of innovative spirit with us and are willing to try different things, go with the flow, is how we're going to, succeed in the future.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Todd said. I do think that, being open and being willing to try out things that are uncomfortable, to being okay with being uncomfortable with something new, and trying it and taking risks. I think part of why we've been successful is that Todd and I are both, I think we're fairly, pragmatic, low key folks, but we have an element of risk taking when it come in our personalities and in our approach. And we've been willing to take some risks. And I think you just have to do that. And especially in this environment, you have to say, all right, well, this is maybe a little bit untested, or we don't know everything that we'd like to know about this going in, but we can learn it. We can figure it out. And I think that is something that served us really well. I think you can't know everything that you'd like to know before you dive into a project these days. There's a lot of learning. So you sort of trusting yourself that you have this knowledge and background and experience that can kind of guide the decisions that you make. Because so many times in the last few months, I've been like, wow, we did that. I'm so glad that worked out.
Jumped out of the plane and build your parachute on the way down?
A little bit, I think it's just trusting yourself that you can get there a little bit. So yeah, I guess it's a balance, right? Because you don't want to, go off half, crazy in any direction, but being okay to say, okay, we'll get through it. We'll figure it out. We're smart. It can't be, we can get there. So I don't know. There's been a lot of that. Just we'll become experts very soon.
And then there'll be something else to figure out.
Exactly.
That's what keeps it fun.
Exactly. And I do like what Todd said about, hiring people with similar kind of entrepreneurial and innovative sort of approaches to things. I think that's something that was hard for us at first. We knew we were a good team, but figuring out how to hire the right people who would like our approach and thrive in that environment. And I feel like we finally now, after 7-8 years, have kind of got that down, but that took a little while.
Well, it's fascinating. Well, we could probably talk for hours about all the ins and outs and intricacies and nuances of simultaneous interpretation and translation. But I'm so happy that you found the time to join us on a cold January afternoon. If people want to learn more about Tiller Language Services and the services that you provide, what's the best way for them to reach out and contact you?
I'd say you could check out our website is tillerlanguage.com, or you can always send us an email at info@tillerglobal.com.
Yep.
All right, Spencer, if people want to learn more about the work that you do to help organizations thrive in uncertain situations, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Well, thank you. I've just been thinking, I mean, I'm speaking next month in Austria from my home, and I speak, places around the world. And I'm just thinking, how could there seems like there's so many more options when you have these interpretive services. So I'll be thinking of you guys in the future. But to reach me, altiumleadership.com, ALTIUM leadership.com, or Spencer at altiumleadership.com. And Christian, how can we find you, my amazing friend?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn, Christian Napier, or you can go to my website, gp4.com. That's gpfour.com, or you can find me at cnapier@gp4.com. That's my email address. All right, Todd, Maureen, thank you so much for joining us. Listeners, please like and subscribe to our podcast, and we'll catch you again soon. Todd and Maureen, thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Great to talk to you guys.
Thank you.